Journalist Nicholas Kristof has been on the ground covering some of the biggest international stories of the past 4 decades, from his Pulitzer Prize-winning coverage of the Tiananmen Square massacre and the war in Iraq to the ongoing wars in Gaza and the Darfur region of Sudan. He chronicles his career in his new memoir, Chasing Hope, A Reporter's Life. And Nicholas Kristof joins me now. Thank you for being here. It's a pleasure to have a chance to talk with you. The book is a wonderful read. There are too many things I want to ask you about. We can't get to them all, even in a half an hour, give or take. It seems to me that this operates on 3 different levels, at least it did for me. It's a story of personal formation, sort of a Bildungsroman about yourself, or a non-fictional Bildungsroman. It is also a snapshot of a particular moment in political history, cultural history, and it's this really interesting examination of the way journalism is practiced, the assumptions we make about how journalism is practiced, and maybe ways that it could be practiced that we don't think about. All that being said, why'd you write the book now, at this point in your career, at this point in history?
So, maybe in the acknowledgments, I should have actually thanked the Oregon Secretary of State, because she tossed me out of the governor's race running there.
Yep.
And all of a sudden, I had time on my hands, and I didn't have to ask any editor for book leave. And so that was the timing. I wish I could say it was some grand, historical plot, but no.
Right. Okay. Well, I was going to ask you about the run for governor later, but since you brought it up, let's just get to it right now. I'm wondering what you learned about politics in that run that didn't work out because you were deemed not eligible to run. What did you learn about politics that you didn't know before?
It was funny because I'd been politics adjacent for so long, and it was quite different being on the other side. One of the things I learned was that, I thought politics was pretty dysfunctional. Boy, it was more dysfunctional than I'd expected. Really? And in particular, the emphasis on campaign fundraising, I think, skewed the kind of people we talk. In the primary, I'm very focused on raising funds. We were very good at it, but it meant that I was talking to wealthy and older people. I think that in primaries, the average primary voter is something like 58 years old. The median campaign donation comes from a 63-year-old. And so you're not talking about public schools. You're not talking about kids. It was also constraining on the kind, as a columnist, I have a license to piss people off, if you will. And as a candidate trying to get votes, particularly in a primary, it was harder. And, in Portland, Oregon, we have all kinds of problems, and it struck me that often donors wanted me to talk about how awful Republicans were. And it always struck me that in Portland, we just can't blame Republicans for Portland's mess because there aren't any Republicans there.
Yeah. My sense from your writing about that campaign was that you may have become more frustrated than you had been before by certain progressive pieties that you encountered. And I want to ask if that's fair. Because I think of you, and my guess is a lot of viewers will think of you as sort of a man of the left, broadly speaking, someone with a liberal sensibility. What were the progressive pieties that you ran into when you were running for governor that made you balk a bit?
Fundamentally, it was the gulf between the values and the outcomes, that we were all about values and slogans and, repeating housing as a human right. But that doesn't actually get people housed. And changing the language with which we refer to problems, like, don't refer to the homeless, talk to people who are houseless, and so on, rather than really challenging all those problems. And I found that very frustrating. I think that there is pretty good evidence about how to, chip away at some of these problems around us. And instead, I think we often focused on the performative rather than the substantive.
Let's go back much, much further, way before you run for governor. I'd like to know about the role that your father played shaping your worldview, but also your approach to journalism. And that will require you to give viewers a crash course into who your father was and what he experienced before he came to this country. Can you give us a micro-history of your dad?
So my dad was he was an ethnic Armenian growing up in an area called Northern Bukovina in Eastern Europe. And then the family spied on the Nazis during the war, got into trouble. He was a refugee in Eastern Europe in a concentration camp. And his life was saved by a French diplomat who kind of broke the rules to save his life. And he arrived in the U.S. in 1952, sponsored by some families in Oregon. But it was in particular the way in which that French diplomat intervened went pretty close to the edge of what he was supposed to do to save my dad's life. It really, I think, shaped me in a couple of ways. I mean, one, as a journalist, of course, I encountered all the times conflicts between my professional obligations as a New York Times employee and as a journalist and my human obligations. And I think that experience of my family made me a little more focused on my human obligations. And second, all the time we aim to solve problems. And I became a believer in, if you can't solve a problem, at least a drop in the bucket helps some family somewhere. When these families helped my dad, that did not solve the refugee crisis. It was pretty transformative for my family.
You also talk in the book about your fundamental optimism, even though you have covered all these horrific events, situations that would maybe push someone in the opposite direction. I'm wondering, well, actually, let me read just a quote. And I believe this was from the column that accompanied the release of your book in the Times. I think we've got the quote right here about your fundamental optimism. Some people see my career covering massacres and oppression and assume that I must be dour and infused with misery, a journalistic ER. Not so. Journalism is an act of hope, whilst reporters rush toward gunfire, visit COVID wards, or wade into riots to interview arsonists. We do all this because we believe that better outcomes are possible if we just get people to understand more clearly what's going on. I'm wondering if that stems from your father's experience as well.
Yeah, I think it was. I mean, he saw the worst of humanity, but he also benefited because people were able to intervene to help him. And I think that despair is fundamentally paralyzing. And I worry that we in the news business, that we focus so much on planes that crash as opposed to the millions of planes that are landing safely, that we inadvertently give the impression that everything is going wrong all the time. And in fact, there is a backdrop of moral and material progress that I think should inspire us about our capacity to chip away at problems, to address problems, and to overcome them, to build a sense of self-efficacy. How
do you strike that balance, though, when you are doing things like covering the conflict in Yemen? I think we've got a picture here of you fist-bumping an extremely malnourished-looking young man. When you're covering something like the conflict in Yemen, seeing human toll that is taken like that, or when you are covering genocide in Darfur, which you have been doing for quite a long time, how do you, on the one hand, sound a clarion call that's going to make people pay attention to horrible things happening that they might not want to pay attention to, while at the other hand, not making them feel so pessimistic and dispirited that they ignore that hopefully upward arc that you just described?
So I'm not sure I've gotten the balance right. I don't think there's a perfect algorithm. But what I try to do is lay out exactly how bad things are, but to show that if we do something or other, then there can be a better outcome, to show that there is a potential positive arc. And so, and that's really kind of what I learned, I think, in covering Darfur. I was very frustrated that I'd write these columns that had no impact, and that led me to the work in social psychology and in neuroscience about what makes us care. And it's fundamentally about individual stories, and it's also about showing that people can make a difference, that it's not just unremittingly gloomy.
And that if the scale, tell me if I've got this right, but if the scale is too vast, it immediately conjures up hopelessness.
It's a turn-off. Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And actually, there's a quote from the book that I'd love to read where you describe this idea. You write, "We focus on scale. Millions are at risk and emphasize the problem so much that we don't fully acknowledge the opportunities for improvement. All this is a turn-off. So increasingly, I began to tell, as you said, individual stories and broaden the scene to describe the larger problem." How long did it take you to come to that realization that that was the way to do it?
It was fairly quick in the sense that it emerged when I was covering Darfur, and I was just so frustrated. I was writing these columns; they were disappearing without a trace. And at that same time, I don't know if you remember, but in New York City, there were these two hawks.
Yep. Living on Fifth Avenue, right?
Exactly. And they were pushed out of their building because they were bird droppings. And all of New York was up in arms about these two homeless hawks. And I thought, how is it that I can't generate the same outrage about hundreds of thousands of people being killed and driven from their homes? And so that's what led me to this work by a scholar in particular named Paul Slovic, who explained how to get people to care.
When I read about your early life, becoming effectively a working journalist in the middle of high school at a time when not many people have settled on their career or are putting out a paper, going on to Harvard, becoming a Rhodes Scholar after a few years earlier, saying, well, I better be a Rhodes Scholar because it seems like like a lot of prominent journalists are doing immersion training in Arabic, interning at the Post, catching on at the Times. I felt like I was reading, and you don't do this, it's very sort of humble, modest, reflective memoir, but I felt like I was reading about just an inexorable journalistic force. And I'm wondering if it felt that way in the moment as you were living through.
Not at all.
Really?
Not at all. And, I think it could have, I think I was incredibly lucky at many stages, and it could have been, I think I could have ended up a reporter at the Oregonian, and I think I would have been very happy doing that. But I just, at each stage, I got lucky, and then luck begets more luck. And so, I got lucky and won the Rhodes Scholarship. That helped me get the Washington Post internship, was really lucky, which helped me get employed by the Times.
I'm not trying to give you a hard time here. You may have gotten lucky, and you talk about the extent to which your family paved the way and the love and support and encouragement you got from them paved the way for you to live the life that you lived. But it was also about a lot of hard work, right? I mean, when you had the Rhodes Scholarship, you weren't just sort of enjoying Oxford or the British Isles when you had time off. You were going abroad. Yeah, I mean, you were in Poland when martial law was declared, right? Just because it was an opportunity to. Am I right about that?
That's true, but I think there's a tendency among people who've been successful to look in the mirror and say, "Boy, you did everything right. You worked hard. You were smart, and that's why you're successful." And I think fundamentally, the reason people are successful is because they chose the right parents to be born to, and then the rest follows from that.
And the breaks go their way. You talk at one point, where were you traveling in Africa when you met a young woman who you were going to meet up with when you reached your destination?
Yeah, and that was in Sudan, and then she left. We were going to meet in Khartoum, and that evening she had hitched a ride, and her truck slammed into another truck just in the middle of the road, and she died. And it was useful, I've got to say, early on in my career, discovering that we're mortal, and that, another incident that really shook me was I was traveling with a friend, and we got to a checkpoint, and everything was going fine. Then at the checkpoint, there were these two drunken soldiers, and I thought they were going to just shoot us, and they robbed us. I thought they were also going to shoot us. And there was no control we had over the situation.
Was this where you describe, forgive me, which country was this in?
This was in Ghana. Right after the coup.
So you're in Ghana, and was that where the soldier said, "I'm going to shoot you"?
That was actually another checkpoint.
There's so much. Okay.
But yeah, that was also in Ghana.
So the first checkpoint in Ghana that you mentioned, you are anticipating being killed by these soldiers, and then what happens?
That checkpoint where the guy said, "I'm going to shoot you," I don't think he was actually trying to shoot me. I think he just wanted my camera.
But the other one, because my recollection is that when a bus rolls up?
Yes, correct. We were just lucky. And suddenly a bus rolled up, and so the soldiers had more people to rob after having just robbed us. And then we were lucky because our car stayed so that we could then. And
your driver could have just gotten out.
He could have just, if he'd been, if he'd been smart, he would have just left. But he stuck around for us, taking some risks. And I benefited so much from people like that all over the world.
One theme, and we've alluded to it earlier, but one theme that comes up again and again in the book is whether traditional journalistic ideals of detachment and objectivity, being an observer, not an actor, whether they are good guidelines, at least for most journalists, or whether they deserve to be substantially reconsidered. Where do you come down on that?
So I'm curious also, where you think about, I think there's been a real ferment in journalism about these issues, both about should we be on the sidelines or should we try to influence outcomes, and second about especially I think since Donald Trump entered politics, to what extent we should tell our audiences kind of what we know about the mendacity, for example, of a particular candidate. And I'm, I think in general we are meant to be on the sidelines, but if there is a kid dying in front of us, we don't just pull out our notebook and take notes as the child dies. We rush that child to a hospital. We do what we can. And I've skated pretty close to the edge. In China, I helped a dissident flee the country.
One of your sources, right?
One of our sources.
And he said, I got to get out of here.
He was a 19-year-old kid, partly because he had helped us. He'd been imprisoned. He escaped from prison. He came to us and asked for help.
Your wife helped drive that decision as well, right? You said that
That's right.
She immediately said, "Yeah, we gotta do this," and you weren't so sure.
I'm kind of embarrassed that I was not sure we should help him. You know, the one pretty basic rule of being a foreign correspondent is you don't help escaped felons flee the country. I thought we might get caught. I thought the New York Times bureau would be closed down, and I was trying to weigh our responsibilities to the New York Times and to the profession versus the obligations to this young man who'd helped us. And it was really because my wife had a better moral compass than I did that we ended up helping him, and he was able to escape, and he's now in America. And
the Times was okay with what you did.
Because it worked.
Good point.
Yeah, I mean, if we had been arrested and the bureau had been closed down, I'm not sure they would have been so enthusiastic about it. But I think they felt that, that same pride. And there have been these other experiences where I left the sidelines and did try to help people, maybe because of the experience with my dad. And, I'm generally glad I did. And then there's this larger question about moral purpose. And I think that a lot of us went into journalism because we thought that we serve a role in society, that there is we serve some goal greater than quarterly earnings of our companies. But now I think there are a lot of young journalists who would take that a lot further than I would, and don't think that conservatives should be platformed, for example. Well, I deeply do.
That was a part of the book that I found fascinating. You talked about your response to the backlash to the Times running that op-ed by Senator Tom Cotton, titled "Bring in the Troops" at the height of the Black Lives Matter movement. What was it that made you uncomfortable about the response that elicited in large parts of the Times newsroom?
So I think there is a real problem with the lack of credibility that mainstream organizations have among conservatives. And I don't think the solution is to pull punches when conservative politicians lie or mislead people. But I do think that we would have more credibility if we had more conservative letters to the editor, more conservative op-eds. And for the same reason that I go out in Afghanistan and try to talk to extremist jihadis to try to understand their way of thinking, I think it's important for our audiences to understand, extremists, if you will, in this country. And I don't think that necessarily legitimizes them. I think we need to be careful to avoid that. But so, as it happens, I thought that particular Tom Cotton op-ed was not great. But you
weren't impressed by it, but the idea of running
a Tom Cotton op-ed that goes against everything I believe in, the idea of having more op-eds that are against my liberal views on gun policy, on abortion, on every possible issue. I think that is important to have those conservative views, and I think they make a good escort for my liberal views.
You mentioned how to cover Trump as one of the big things that the media wrestled with. I want to just read briefly an excerpt from the book of what you wrote about the way we handled that in 2016, broadly speaking. You write, traditional coverage did not work. Discussing each candidate's allegations against the other was a sideshow when one candidate was running against democracy itself, and we were too slow to use the word lie to capture Trump's deliberate, repeated falsehoods. Are we in any meaningful way in a different spot now than we were during the 2016 campaign? Or are we wrestling with the same issues?
We're wrestling with the same issue. I think we're in a little better place, but we'll find that out. I mean, to me, the biggest failure of 2016 was cable television realizing they could monetize Trump and interest in Trump by just, running him, speaking endlessly, saying lie after lie, and not providing fact-checking, not truth-squatting him. I think that we are getting better at providing that kind of context and that truth-squatting. But it's a very fine line between, I believe the importance of covering the statements that he makes and others make, but also then, providing that context and that fact check. And I think of it, maybe to some degree the way we act as foreign correspondents, that we will interview Vladimir Putin or Xi Jinping, and we will say what they say, but we will then also try to point out that they are dictators, that they are ruthless, etc. And we do that intuitively about Russia or China. I think we should try to bring some of that toolbox here at home.
I would love to hear how you think the media, broadly speaking, I know, media is plural, it's tough to make sweeping generalizations, but I'll ask you to anyway. How have we done covering the war in Gaza, do you think?
There are just some journalists who've done heroic work there. I think that we were quite good in covering the October 7th attack and the brutality of that attack and the suffering on the Israeli side. I think we were slow in reporting the horrors unfolding in Gaza after that. And that was partly because there wasn't much political debate in the U.S. that everybody was kind of accepting it.
That's
and
true.
And I think we often take our cues from the political debate, but I think we were, slow in, just acknowledging the number of children being killed in Gaza, the hunger that was building. I think now, we've gotten an awful lot better at that.
I would like to know, you chronicle in the book a wide variety of just incredible feats of reporting. That's my word, not yours. These huge successes covering Tiananmen Square, covering Darfur, covering the war in Iraq. I could go on, your coverage from China with your wife. But you also are reflective about mistakes that you've made. You don't hesitate to point out lessons that you've learned, going all the way back to when you started your journalism career in the middle of high school. I'm wondering if there are one or two examples of things that, as you look back from the perch that you now have managed to acquire in the journalistic world, are there certain things that still gnaw at you when you look back at them? And if so, Can you give me the example, maybe one or two examples?
Well, since you mentioned going back to high school, there was a case when in pursuing a story, I don't know how else to put it, I was mean. I wrote a piece that really hurt not only the person that I was writing about, but his family as well.
Is this the man who was a member of Posse Comitatus?
Exactly.
The progenitor of the modern-day militia movement?
Exactly. He was basically a kind of a militia member, and he was very full of himself and said all kinds of extremist things. He was living in my small town of 500 people, and his wife was horrified at the idea that he was giving this interview. And I wrote a long piece about his views, and he ended up leaving town, and I think that I overstated, or kind of implicitly, some kind of threat that he posed. I don't think at the end of the day he did. I think I made too much of it, and I think I really hurt somebody, and and his wife and his son. And I think that it's very easy for us as journalists, when we get together and talk among ourselves and among our editors, to get excited about a story and jump on it, and sometimes forget that the people we are writing about are complicated people, and
that there are actual human lives at stake.
Yeah.
I have one. I won't go into it here because people aren't here to listen to me reflect. But I have one thing like that when a story that I wrote involving what was off the record and what was on background, there was a misunderstanding, and I ended up conveying things that people had said that they did not want conveyed. And when I think about it now, it's still
choosing.
I don't like it. No, I know there was a human cost to it, and I'm filled with regret when I think about it.
We screw up in journalism, and we hurt sources because we're not careful enough sometimes. We do all, and I think it's incumbent on us to be as prudent and cautious as we possibly can, because we have this incredibly powerful platform.
In a sense, I'm going back to the start of your book here, but another big influence, we talked about your father earlier on, and your parents, the role they played setting you up to do what you've done. How important was the community that you grew up in, Yamhill, Oregon, and because my sense reading the book is that you took lessons from growing up in Yamhill that may be as important as anything else you've learned over the course of your life.
Yeah, it's been I'd say increasingly important, because when I was growing up in this working class blue collar town, it was actually fairly successful, and it seemed that there was a lot of upward mobility. And then the jobs in the sawmills and the factories went away, and meth arrived, and people self-medicated. And the community kind of unraveled in important ways, or a lot of families did. And so at this point, more than a third of the kids on my old school bus are gone from drugs, alcohol,
That's
suicide.
Remarkable.
It's just, and it's not, when this was first happening, my wife and I would talk about this, and I was wondering, is this my old school bus? Is this my town? Is the water? And it wasn't, of course. It's working class communities around the country. And my friends suffered greatly, but they also inflicted great suffering on others. And I look back, and I don't think that journalists, politicians, elites have adequately focused on just the intense suffering across the country. More than 100,000 Americans dying each year from overdoses. And I spent a lot of time in Iraq and Afghanistan. I think they were incredibly important stories. But every 2.5 weeks, we lose more Americans from those deaths of despair than died in 20 years of war in Afghanistan and Iraq. And I don't think we have adequately conveyed the horror of what has been happening in those communities around the country.
We've only got about a minute left, but why do you think that is? Is it because it's too hard to look at the place that we call home and see problems that are this deep and painful?
I think that we're not good at talking about things that are painful and stigmatized, and we hush them up. I think that's part of it. And I think that educated people, there's a gulf between educated people and working class people, and often we look down on those with less education. Michael Sandel says it's the last prejudice that we have in America. I think there's something to that.
You mentioned at one point in the book, what was the thing that a lot of people snickered at? Donald Trump's syntax having a sixth grade level, something like that?
Yeah.
And in fact, the average reading level in the United States
was something
right
parallel to that,
Fifth
right?
grade, sixth grade, somewhere.
Yeah. I mean, I think we can be pretty full of ourselves, and I think it's just as when we're in Afghanistan covering these distant places and ordinary people, we need to do a better job of covering these crises across our own country.
I wish I had another half hour to ask you a whole bunch more questions, but I do not. We have to leave it there. Nick Kristof, congratulations on the book. It is a true pleasure to read.
Thank you so much, Adam.
The book, again, is Chasing Hope, A Reporter's Life.